The Coalition fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of human space, and their sensors immediately detected the enemy force waiting for them. Admiral Tehain of the Kathrani Dominion studied the display and frowned because something was wrong. Report. He ordered. Human fleet detected. His tactical officer responded. Approximately 300 vessels in standard defensive formation. That matches our intelligence. The Admiral said, "What concerns me is what else I am seeing. Behind the small human fleet, another force was assembling, and then another, and the sensors kept updating as more ships arrived from every direction." "Sir," the tactical officer said with growing alarm, "I am counting over 2,000 additional vessels, and they are not human designs. Identify them." The Admiral demanded. Asharan heavy cruisers and Tizen destroyers and Chengdu fighters and Hanxian patrol ships, and I am reading ships from every world the humans liberated, and they are all flying in formation with the human fleet. Admiral Tehain felt cold fear settle in his stomach because this changed everything. The Coalition had expected to crush a small human force with overwhelming numbers, but instead, they faced a combined fleet of every species that humanity had freed, and those ships were crewed by people who remembered Kathrani occupation and who had chosen to stand with their liberators. "We still outnumbered them 3-1. His aide pointed out, "Numbers mean nothing when facing an enemy who would rather die than surrender." The Admiral replied. A communication request appeared on his display, and he accepted it knowing exactly who would be on the other end. De Young appeared on the screen with Yuna standing beside him, and his expression was calm and patient, like a teacher waiting for a student to understand a lesson. "Admiral," De Young said, "I wanted to speak with you before this goes any further. You wish to negotiate your surrender?" Admiral Tehain asked. "No," De Young replied. "I wish to give you a choice. The Coalition does not negotiate with criminals." The Admiral said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Look at the fleet behind me," De Young continued. "These are people from worlds that were told they did not matter, and that their suffering was acceptable, and that the strong had the right to destroy the weak." He paused to let the words sink in. "They are here because we showed them a different way," he said. "We freed them, and then we helped them rebuild, and we treated them as equals. And they chose to stand with us because loyalty earned is stronger than obedience forced. You cannot defeat us," Admiral Tehain said, but it sounded more like a question than a statement. "Perhaps not," De Young admitted, "but we can hurt you badly enough that your Coalition will fracture, and then the worlds you thought were secure will rise up because they have seen what freedom looks like, and they want it for themselves." The Admiral was silent because he knew the human was right. Already the conscript crews on his own ships were restless because they came from conquered worlds, and they had heard stories of the human consort and what he had done for others like them. "I am not asking you to surrender," De Young said. "I am asking you to change." "Change what?" the Admiral asked. "Everything," De Young answered. "The old galactic order is broken, and it rewards cruelty and punishes compassion. And it must end because no species should have to live in fear of being erased simply for being weaker. What you describe is impossible." Admiral Tehain said, "The powers of the galaxy would never accept such terms. Some of them already have." De Young replied. The display changed to show messages from 3 members of the Coalition, who had secretly contacted the human delegation. In the past day, the Rithani had withdrawn from the Coalition, entirely citing economic concerns, but everyone knew they simply did not want to fight a war that could not be won cleanly. The Syntheri had offered neutrality in exchange for trade agreements, because their collective logic processors had calculated that the Coalition was unlikely to achieve its objectives. The Keldaran were fractured because half their noble houses believed the Coalition was making a mistake. "Your alliance is already breaking," De Young said. and it will break further if you attack because every world watching will see what happens and they will make their own choices. Admiral Tehain looked at his tactical display and saw 10,000 ships, and then he looked at the enemy fleet and saw 2,000 ships crewed by people with nothing to lose. The numbers favored him, but the mathematics of war had never been so simple. What terms do you propose? He finally asked. A new council with real representation for all species. Taeyong said, an end to conquest as an accepted practice and protections for weaker civilizations against stronger ones, and justice for those who suffered under the old order. The Kethrani Dominion would never accept such terms. The admiral said, then the Kethrani Dominion will stand alone. Taeyong replied, and alone they cannot win. The admiral made his decision, and it was the hardest choice of his career, but also the wisest. 3 members of the coalition withdrew that day, and the Kethrani fleet attacked alone and discovered that fighting people who believed in their cause was very different from conquering people who had lost hope. The battle was fierce and costly, and when it ended, the Kethrani had lost half their ships and their admiral was dead, and the survivors retreated to their home systems to defend what remained of their dominion. The galaxy watched and understood that everything had changed. 6 months later, the new Galactic Council held its first session, and representatives from 70 species took their seats, including humans and Valari and every other people who had been told they did not matter. Taeyong did not attend because he had refused every political position that was offered to him, and instead he stood with Yuna in a small house by the ocean on Earth, where his grandmother lived. You could have been emperor of the galaxy, Yuna said as she watched the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. I never wanted to be an emperor. Taeyong replied, I only wanted to keep my promise to you. You gave me back my worlds. She said softly, I gave you back hope. He corrected, the worlds were just the beginning. She leaned against him and felt his arm wrap around her shoulders, and together they watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. What do you want now? She asked, now that the wars are over. I want to show you this ocean in the morning when the light is just right, he said, and I want to cook you breakfast the way my grandmother taught me, and I want to walk with you on the beach and talk about nothing important. That sounds very small for a man who conquered worlds, Yuna said with a gentle smile. I did not conquer them for glory. Taeyong replied, I conquered them for you, and now I want to spend my days with you, and that is enough. Yuna reached up and touched his face and turned him toward her, and kissed him as the last light of day faded into peaceful darkness. The most feared commander in galactic history had wanted nothing more than to take his wife home, and finally he had. The stars above held the peace they had built together, and the galaxy would remember their names for 1,000 generations, not as conquerors, but as the ones who showed that strength without compassion was weakness, and that love could move worlds. The Galactic Council chamber fell silent when the human delegation entered, and every ambassador turned to watch the man who had turned the balance of power upside down. Taeyong walked with Yuna at his side, and his simple military uniform stood in stark contrast to the elaborate robes and ceremonial armor worn by the representatives of ancient stellar empires. You have caused us considerable trouble, the Rathani Prime Minister said without preamble. Your little war has destabilized trade routes across 3 sectors. The Valari Empire was being destroyed. Taeyong replied calmly, we chose to help them. You chose to interfere in matters that did not concern your primitive species. The Keldaran High King interrupted. The Kethrani and Valari have been at war for centuries, and the outcome was inevitable. Until you arrived. The outcome was genocide, Yuna said sharply. The Kethrani do not merely conquer, they erase, and my people would have ceased to exist. That is the way of the galaxy, the Synthary Collective representative stated with cold logic. The weak perish and the strong survive. and this has always been true. Then perhaps it is time for the galaxy to change. De Jong said. The chamber erupted in angry voices, and it took several minutes for the council arbiter to restore order. You speak of change, the arbiter said when silence returned. But what you have done is chaos, and the powers of this council have agreed that it cannot continue. Agreed on what exactly? Do Jung asked. The arbiter pressed a control, and a holographic display appeared showing the positions of fleets across the galaxy. Earth must withdraw from the conflict immediately, the arbiter announced. All human forces must return to your home system, and you personally must surrender yourself to this council for trial as a war criminal. Yuna grabbed De Jong's arm in alarm, but he showed no reaction to the ultimatum. And if we refuse, he asked, then the combined fleets of 6 stellar nations will enforce compliance, the Kethrani ambassador said, with undisguised satisfaction. Over 10,000 warships against your few hundred, and even your clever tricks cannot overcome those odds. The display changed to show the coalition fleet assembling at the border of human space, and it was the largest military force the galaxy had ever seen united under a single command. You have 7 days to comply, the arbiter said. After that, we will end the human threat permanently. De Jong studied the display for a long moment and then nodded slowly. We will give you our answer tomorrow, he said, and turned to leave the journey. Back to their ship was silent, and Yuna could see the tension in her husband's shoulders, even though his face remained calm. 10,000 ships, she finally said when they were alone. De Jong, you cannot win against 10,000 ships. Probably not, he admitted. Then we must run, she said desperately. We can take what forces we have and flee to the far rim and find a place where they cannot follow, and abandon every world we liberated. De Jong asked. Abandon the people who trusted us. To save your life, Yuna cried. To save our people and give us a chance to rebuild somewhere. De Jong took her hands in his and looked into her eyes. I made you a promise, he said softly. I promised to return your worlds, and I have not finished yet. Forget the promise, she begged, and tears streamed down her face. I do not want worlds, I want you, and I cannot lose you. You will not lose me, he said. How can you say that? She demanded. You are facing impossible odds. I have always faced impossible odds, De Jong reminded her. And I have found that impossible only means no one has figured out how to do it yet. He held her close and let her cry against his chest. And when she had exhausted her tears, he led her to the command center where his senior officers waited. You have all seen the ultimatum, he said. And you know what we face. We stand with you, Captain J1 said, and the others nodded in agreement. I will not order you to die for a hopeless cause, De Jong said. Anyone who wishes to leave may do so without shame. No one moved. Very well, De Jong said, and a fierce pride burned in his voice. Then let me show you what we are going to do. He activated the holographic display and brought up a map of the galaxy. The coalition believes they hold all the power because they have the most ships, he explained. But ships are not power, and power comes from something else entirely. What? Lieutenant Commander Mi-young asked. People, De Jong answered. People who believe in something worth fighting for. He highlighted the 12 worlds they had liberated, and then the dozens of other worlds that remained under Kethrani occupation. Every world we freed remembers what we did for them, he continued. And every world still enslaved dreams of what we might do, and the coalition sees subjects to be controlled. But I see allies waiting to be awakened. You want to arm the resistance movements. Admiral Seong Min said slowly. I want to give them a choice, De Jong corrected. And I want to give the coalition the same choice. What choice? Yuna asked. De Jong smiled, and it was the same smile she had seen the night he asked which world she wanted back first. The choice between war with us and peace with everyone, he said. because we are not fighting to conquer anymore, and we are fighting to change how the galaxy works. And that is not something that can be defeated by ships alone. He began explaining his plan, and as he spoke, Yuna felt that fragile thing called hope begin to grow in her chest once again, because her husband did not know how to accept defeat. And he had never failed her yet. The next morning, Earth's government received a coalition ultimatum, and the elected leaders gathered to decide the fate of their species. The vote was unanimous. They would stand with their soldier, and they would answer tyranny with defiance. 8 months after the liberation of Ashara, the galaxy had learned a new name, and that name was Park Dae-Young. Some called him the Human Consort, and others called him the Ghost Commander, because his fleets appeared from nowhere and vanished like smoke, and the Kethrani never knew where he would strike next. 12 worlds had been freed, and each victory was different from the last because Dae-Young never repeated his tactics, and what worked once was never used again. He fights like no one we have ever faced. The Kethrani Supreme Admiral reported to her council. He does not follow any doctrine, and he does not honor any tradition, and he treats war like a puzzle to be solved, rather than a sacred ritual. Then solve the puzzle, the council demanded. But they could not solve it because Dae-Young was not playing by rules they understood. On the world of Tizen, he had won without firing a single shot by broadcasting evidence that the local Kethrani governor had been stealing from the military supply lines, and the garrison had arrested their own commander and surrendered in exchange for amnesty. On the moons of Chenju, he had seeded the asteroid field with automated beacons that mimicked warship signatures, and the Kethrani fleet had wasted 3 weeks hunting phantoms while his real forces slipped past and liberated the colony on the station of Guamyong. He had challenged the Kethrani commander to single combat in powered armor, and when the commander accepted, Dae-Young had simply talked to him for 6 hours about the futility of the war, and the commander had ordered his ships to stand down. Each victory was impossible until it happened, and then it seemed obvious in hindsight, and the Kethrani could never predict what he would do next. But it was not the battles that spread his legend across the stars. It was what came after Yuna accompanied her husband to the world of Hanxiang 3 weeks after its liberation, and what she saw there changed how she understood the man she had married. The cities were damaged from the fighting, and the people were thin from years of rationing under Kethrani rule, and everyone expected the liberating forces to take what they wanted, as conquerors always did. Instead, Dae-Young ordered his ships to distribute their emergency supplies to the civilian population, and human engineers began repairing power stations and water treatment facilities, and human medics set up clinics in the streets. We cannot afford this. Admiral Seong Min protested when he learned of it. Those supplies are meant for our crews, and those engineers should be repairing our ships. Those people are our people now, Dae-Young replied, and they will remember how we treated them. He was right. On world after world, the story spread of the human commander, who fought like a demon but ruled like a saint, and resistant cells that had been dormant for decades began to activate, because they believed liberation was finally possible. Yuna watched her husband sit with refugees in a makeshift shelter and listen to an old woman tell stories of life before the occupation, and she felt something shift inside her heart. "Why do you do this?" she asked him later when they were alone. "You could simply take these worlds and move on, but instead you spend days and weeks helping people you have never met." Dae-Young was quiet for a long moment before he answered. "When I was young, my grandmother told me stories of our homeland," he said. "Korea was occupied by a foreign power for 35 years, and when liberation came, the people remembered everything that had been done to them and everything that had been taken from them." He looked out the window at the damaged city below. "She told me that freedom is not just about removing the conquerors," he continued. "It is about restoring the dignity that was stolen and showing people that they matter and that their suffering was seen and acknowledged." You fight for people you do not know, Yuna said softly. People who are not even your species. Someone has to. Taeyong replied, and I made you a promise. You promised to retake my worlds. Yuna said, you did not promise to love their people. I did not need to promise that, he said. It came naturally. The Kethrani responded to their losses by sending their most celebrated commander to stop the human consort once and for all. Admiral Kyong-ae had never lost a battle in 40 years of service, and her fleet was the largest and most powerful in the Dominion, and she approached the task with the cold confidence of a hunter who knows her prey cannot escape. She caught Taeyong's fleet in the Jiangmi system with nowhere to run, and her 200 ships formed a perfect killing formation around his 40 vessels, human. She broadcast on all channels. You have fought well, but you are trapped now and your war ends here, so surrender, and I will grant your crews honorable treatment. Admiral Taeyong replied, I have a counteroffer. You are in no position to make offers. She said, your fleet is not loyal to you, Taeyong said calmly. 60% of your crews are conscripts from conquered worlds, and they serve because they have no choice, but they dream of freedom. Every night, my crews are disciplined. The Admiral replied, but there was a note of uncertainty in her voice. I have been broadcasting to them for the last 3 hours. Taeyong continued, offering asylum and citizenship to anyone who stands down, and my transports are ready to receive them. They would not dare. Admiral Kyong-ha said, but they dared. Across her fleet, the conscripted crews overpowered their Kethrani officers, and 47 ships signaled surrender, and the perfect killing formation fell apart, and Taeyong's small fleet suddenly faced even odds. The battle was short and brutal, and when it was over, Admiral Kyongja's flagship drifted powerless in space, and she was captured alive. The Valari Emperor summoned Taeyong to the throne world 1 week later, and the man who had mocked the human marriage now rose from his throne and knelt before the human consort. You have done what our finest admirals could not, the Emperor said, and you have given my people something we had forgotten how to feel. What is that? Taeyong asked. Hope? The Emperor replied. He placed the seal of supreme military command in Taeyong's hands, and the weight of an empire's survival settled onto his shoulders. Yuna watched her husband accept the burden with quiet grace, and she realized that she had fallen in love with him somewhere along the way without even noticing. Not because he was a conqueror, but because he was a liberator who conquered worlds and then gave them back to their people. And she wondered what kind of galaxy they might build together. Admiral Seong-min of the Valari Imperial fleet looked at the human standing before him and did not bother hiding his contempt. You want command of a task force, he repeated slowly as if speaking to a child. You who have never commanded anything larger than a patrol boat want to lead ships against the Kethrani. Taeyong stood at attention and kept his voice respectful but firm. I am requesting volunteers only, he said. Ships and crews that others do not want, and I will take full responsibility for the mission. And what mission would that be? Admiral Seong-min asked with a thin smile. The liberation of Ashara, Taeyong answered. The Admiral laughed, and several of his officers joined in because the idea was absurd on its face. Ashara is defended by 200 Kethrani warships. The Admiral said, even if I gave you our entire fleet, which I certainly will not, we could not break through those defenses. Then you have nothing to lose by letting me try. Taeyong replied. The Admiral studied him for a long moment and then shrugged because the human was correct. Take whatever ships will follow you, he said. And when you fail, do not expect rescue because we cannot spare the resources for a doomed mission. Taeyong saluted and left. And within a week, he had gathered his fleet. It was not an impressive sight. 31 vessels answered his call, and most of them were damaged or outdated or crewed by officers who had fallen from favor for various failures and mistakes. Captain J1 commanded a heavy cruiser that had lost half its weapons in a battle 3 years ago and never received repairs because the shipyards had no resources to spare. Lieutenant Commander Mi Young led a squadron of fighters that other commanders called the Broken Wings because their ships were held together with improvised patches and desperate engineering. Chief Yong-ho was a maintenance officer who had been demoted for speaking harsh truths to his superiors, and he came aboard with a team of mechanics who knew how to make broken things work when there were no proper parts available. These were the people Dae-young gathered, and Yuna watched him with confusion as he welcomed them aboard the human destroyer that served as his flagship. "Why these crews?" she asked him privately. "They are considered failures by everyone. They are considered failures because they tried things that did not work," Dae-young explained. "But that means they're willing to try things, and that is more valuable than officers who only follow the old ways." He spent 2 weeks in preparation, and during that time he did something that no Valari commander had ever done before. He talked to everyone, not just the officers, but the common crew members and the maintenance workers and the cooks and the cleaners, and he asked them questions and listened to their answers and wrote everything down. "What are you learning?" Yuna asked him one evening. "I am learning how the Kethrani think," he replied. "Everyone here has fought them, and everyone has watched them, and everyone has noticed small things that seemed unimportant. But when you put all the small things together, a picture forms." "What picture?" she asked. Dae-young smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. "The Kethrani have not changed their tactics in 500 years, he said. They use the same formations and the same strategies and the same communication protocols because they have always worked, and they see no reason to change. Their tactics work because they are superior." Yuna pointed out, "Their tactics work because everyone else uses the same kind of tactics." Dae-young corrected, "They expect formal battle and formation warfare and ritual challenges before engagement, and they are very good at that kind of fight. And you do not intend to give them that kind of fight," Yuna said slowly as understanding began to dawn. "War is not a ritual," Dae-young said. "War is a problem that needs to be solved." The fleet departed 3 days later and jumped to a system that bordered Ashara, and there Dae-young implemented his plan. First, he sent scouts to map every sensor station and patrol route in the Ashara system, and his pilots flew dark with minimal power and recorded everything they saw. Then he captured a Kethrani supply ship, and his communications experts spent 4 days breaking its encryption codes and learning how Kethrani commanders talk to each other. Finally, he divided his tiny fleet into 7 groups and gave each group a specific target and a specific time to strike. The attack began at midnight by the Kethrani military calendar because Dae-young had learned that the Kethrani changed watch shifts at that hour, and there would be 10 minutes of confusion as crews transferred responsibilities. The first group hit a sensor station on the edge of the system and destroyed it before any alarm could be raised. The second group used the captured codes to send false reports of a massive fleet approaching from the opposite direction, and the Kethrani commander responded exactly as doctrine demanded and repositioned half his ships to meet the phantom threat. The third, fourth, and fifth groups struck supply depots and communication relays, and the Kethrani found themselves blind and deaf and unable to coordinate. The sixth group broadcast surrender demands on all frequencies, claiming to represent an overwhelming force, and some Kethrani captains, believing they were surrounded, chose to flee rather than fight, and Dae-young led the seventh group directly at the Kethrani flagship, while the enemy commander was still trying to understand what was happening. The battle lasted 6 hours, and when it was over, 112 Kethrani ships had been destroyed or captured, and 60 more had fled, and Ashara was free. Dae-young had lost 4 ships and 200 crew members, and he personally wrote letters to every family and promised that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. Yuna stood beside him as the Liberation Fleet entered orbit around Ashara, and she watched the celebrations on the planet below through tear-filled eyes. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." "We did it," he corrected. "I only made the plan, but these crews made it work." On the planet below, the people who had lived under Kathrani occupation for 60 years looked up at the sky and saw Valari and human ships, and they wept with joy. And across the galaxy, the powers who had laughed at the human consort suddenly stopped laughing. Because if Ashara could fall, then anything was possible. The Kathrani High Command received the news, and for the first time in their long history, they felt something toward humans that they had never felt toward any species. They felt fear. The throne room of the Valari Empire had seen better days, and everyone who gathered there knew it well enough to feel the shame in their bones. Princess Yuna stood before the gathered ambassadors in ceremonial robes that had been worn by 17 generations of her ancestors, and she kept her face perfectly still as the whispers echoed off the ancient walls. "A human." Someone muttered loud enough for all to hear. "They are marrying their princess to a human." The Kathrani ambassador laughed openly and made no effort to hide his contempt as he leaned toward his aide and spoke in a voice that carried across the chamber. "The mighty Valari have fallen so far that they now beg primitives for help." Yuna did not react because she had been trained since childhood to show nothing and feel nothing when enemies watched, but inside her chest something cracked. Just a little more. Her father, the emperor, sat upon his throne, looking like a man already dead, and his sunken eyes stared at nothing while his advisors conducted the ceremony that would bind his third daughter to a species that had only discovered faster than light travel 40 years ago. The Valari had ruled 1,000 worlds once upon a time, and their fleets had made even the proudest empires bow their heads in respect, but that was centuries past. Now they held 3 systems, and the Kathrani dominion circled them like predators, waiting for wounded prey to finally fall. The marriage was a desperate measure, and everyone in the galaxy knew it. Earth had resources and shipyards, and a population that bred faster than any species the galaxy had ever seen, but they were still newcomers to the stars, and no major power considered them worth serious attention. "We accept the alliance," the human delegation had said when the offer was made. "We will send a suitable husband for your princess." Yuna had expected a politician seeking glory, or perhaps a wealthy merchant buying prestige, but instead the doors opened and a man in a simple military uniform walked into the throne room with steady steps. Lieutenant Commander Park. Dae-Young was not tall by human standards, and he carried no decorations beyond basic service ribbons, and his face showed neither excitement nor fear. As he approached the throne, "You volunteered for this," the Kathrani ambassador called out with amusement dripping from every word. "What fool volunteers to marry into a dying empire?" Dae-Young stopped and turned to face the ambassador, and when he spoke his voice was calm, and "Even I did volunteer," he said simply. "When others would not stand forward, I decided that someone should." "How noble," the ambassador replied with a sneer. "Enjoy your brief marriage, human, because the Valari will fall within the year, and you will fall with them." "Perhaps," Dae-Young answered, and then he turned away as if the most powerful diplomat in the Kathrani dominion was not worth further attention. Yuna watched this exchange with surprise, because she had expected her human husband to cower or bluster or make empty threats, but he did none of these things. The ceremony proceeded according to ancient tradition, and Yuna spoke the words her ancestors had spoken and placed her hand in the hand of this strange, quiet man from a primitive world. When the ritual was complete, the ambassadors offered their congratulations with false smiles and poisoned words, and then they departed to send reports to their governments about the pathetic final gasp of the Valari Empire. Yuna found herself alone with her new husband in the quarters that had been prepared for them, and she sat upon a chair by the window and stared out at the stars that her family had once ruled. "You must understand what you have married into," she said without looking at him. We are dying, and this alliance will not save us, and you have thrown away your future for nothing." Dae-young did not answer immediately, and instead, he walked to the window and stood beside her and looked out at the same stars. "Tell me about your empire," he said quietly. "What is there to tell?" Yuna replied with bitterness she could not hide. "We once held 1,000 worlds, and now we hold 3, and soon we will hold none." "No," Dae-young said. "Tell me about the worlds you lost, and tell me about the people who lived there, and tell me what happened to them." Yuna turned to look at him and saw something in his eyes that she did not expect. He was not looking at the stars with despair or resignation, but with focus and intensity, as if he was solving a problem in his mind. "The Kethrani took them one by one over 300 years," she said slowly. "They would isolate a system and blockade it, and wait until the population starved or surrendered, and then they would move to the next." "And your fleets?" Dae-young asked. "Our fleets followed the old doctrines," Yuna explained. "Formation warfare with elegant maneuvers passed down for millennia. But the Kethrani had more ships and more resources, and eventually numbers overwhelmed skill." Dae-young nodded slowly and walked to the room's computer terminal and began accessing files. "What are you doing?" Yuna asked. "I want to see the star maps," he answered. "I want to see every world your family has lost." "Why?" she demanded with sudden anger. "So you can see how far we have fallen and feel pity for your conquered bride." Dae-young stopped and looked at her, and his expression was not pity, but something else entirely. "No," he said. "I want to know which world you want back first." Yuna stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "You cannot be serious," she said. "The Kethrani have 200 warships guarding the nearest occupied system alone, and your entire species has perhaps 100 vessels total." "I did not ask about the odds," Dae-young replied. "I asked which world you want back first." For a long moment, Yuna could not speak because no one had ever spoken to her this way before. Every advisor and diplomat and military officer had spoken only of managed decline and negotiated surrender and preserving what little remained, but this human spoke of taking back what was lost as if it were simply a matter of deciding where to start. "Ashara," she finally whispered. "My grandmother was born on Ashara before the Kethrani came, and she spoke of it until her dying day, and she made me promise to see it restored." Dae-young nodded and turned back to the computer and pulled up everything the Valari archives held about the Ashara system. "Tell me more," he said. And so Yuna talked, and Dae-young listened and asked questions and took notes, and somewhere in the small hours of the night, Yuna realized that her husband was not a fool who had thrown away his future on a hopeless because he was a man with a plan. She did not yet believe that plan could succeed, but for the first time in years, she felt something she had forgotten the name of. It was hope.